All right, thanks everybody. Welcome back. Mr. Louter.
Sorry, we'll just call our next witness, Mr. Langwell.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Langwell. Just when you're ready, thanks.
Hello, thanks, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. Just like those before me, I'll keep this fairly brief. I prepared two pieces of evidence, one relating to the expansion land at 62 Bluff Road, and then a second relating to the HVL proposals. With 62 Bluff Road, I came to the conclusion that, we don't think that there's any traffic effects that would stop that expansion or rezoning of land from happening, and I've covered that in my evidence, so I don't think I'll say too much more about that. From what I understand, that there was no sort of contentious issues from a traffic perspective from any of the submissions. With regards to the HVL rezoning of land, I identified a number of what I thought were potential adverse effects that we thought would need addressing. And that happens primarily, and I won't go through all of them, but I mean, it happens primarily if you're going to have an industrial zone that splits residential from a centre, you're going to have that interaction where a lot of residential activity is going to want to go through those roads in the industrial zone, whether it's walking or cycling or even vehicle activity. So my assessment was obviously focused on what those effects might be and how they can be addressed. And it's pretty hard to try and stop those effects from occurring if you've got a connected road network. So everyone's going to have the ability to move through that industrial area, and you're going to have the ability to do that. So it's making sure that any adverse effects are addressed through that. I know in Mr. Mead's 42A report that he's suggested some provisions that look at assessing those effects as and when subdivision occurs. I've stated in my evidence that I support that as a provision. And I think that was also the case from HVL's expert traffic witness, Mr. Hills, as well, as he thought he supported that. But I can't sort of get away from the fact that we've got to make sure that it is assessed and that anything that's piecemeal is controlled in such a way that we ensure there are controls put in place to make sure we can manage those effects. So it might be that, and depending on how you stage it, but I think, an overall comprehensive thing that all this stuff probably needs to occur before you develop it and not afterwards. So that's probably about the nutshell of all my evidence. I'm happy for questions if you can.
Thank you, Mr. Langwell. Ms. Cedric?
No, nothing for me, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Gibb?
No, nothing, thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
No, nothing, thank you. Fully understood, yes.
Ms. Tiaho?
Nothing from me either, thank you.
Mr. Cooney?
No, thank you.
No, and I don't have any questions either. Thanks, Mr. Langwell.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your evidence.
So then, very briefly, we've just got Mr. Craig Fitzgerald on noise. I think he will be very short, and then we can finish up with our planning witnesses.
Thank you.
Hopefully, Mr. Fitzgerald is online, joining us by separate link.
Hopefully you can hear me.
There he is.
There he is. Yeah, we can hear you. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Sorry, I'm presenting from home. So my evidence relates to the expansion land only. The noise limits for the Hines site received in the residential village and rural sites are 50 to 55 during the day and 40 to 45 LEPQ at night. And that's irrespective of the current zoning, the resource consent or proposed zoning. We undertook a series of noise measurements at night to understand the current noise emissions. The nighttime noise limits is the most relevant and most stringent thing here. That monitoring established that the Hines site was audible at times in the community, but complied with the noise limits as set out in the consent and in those proposed inoperative rules. We established that the noise effects of the Hines operation were negligible due to the masking of State Highway 1 road traffic noise. That's their current operation. I used that monitoring as well as modelling to look at what the proposed expansion would do to the Hines emissions. From our assessment, we concluded three things. The first thing was that the receiving noise environment would continue to be controlled by State Highway 1. The second, Hines activities on the expansion land would comply with the noise rules in the proposed plan. And thirdly, that there would be negligible change to the cumulative noise levels from Hines site received at the village and rural zone interfaces. Therefore, it is my opinion the noise levels will comply and the effects will be acceptable.
It's pretty short and sweet. Thank you for that. Let's see if there's any questions. Thank you. Ms. Tiaho?
There's nothing from me, and I'm just going to pop off this one and try and load onto my iPad because my camera's playing up.
Okay.
Sorry
Thank
about
you.
that.
That's all right. Thank you. Mr. Fulton?
Yeah, no questions for me, thank you.
Ms. Sedgwick?
I'm just looking at your third point where you say negligible change to the noise levels. What is the noise? And I think that was further back in your summary statement. What is the noise level at the boundary?
So where we measured noise in between traffic movements, even in the middle of the night, you need to do that, to actually measure the industry. And the noise levels from
40 to 45?
No, it's not that high. It's in 35 to 40 kind of range. Here we go, 37 to 40 at the interface with the residential village on the north side and rural to the east, kind of southeast.
Okay, thanks very much.
No problem.
Ms. Gibb?
No, nothing, thank you.
Mr. Cooney?
No, thank you.
And I don't have any questions either. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Fitzgerald.
Not a problem.
We're up to Ms. Nairn and Ms. Chima. Thank you. Mr. Chima, sorry. I knew that. I did know that. It was a slip of the tongue.
Very good. So Mr. Chima and I have done joint evidence, so we're going to be speaking to it jointly today. We hope that's okay.
That's fine.
So the first brief of evidence that we put in related to the zone to be applied to the site at 62 Bluff Road. Here, and the issue that's on the table here, or the relevant question is, should this land be zoned rural, as it was set out in the proposed plan, or should it have a split zone of rural on the upper portion and heavy industrial on the lower portion? In our view, the latter is the most appropriate. And there's 5 key reasons for that, and they relate to good planning outcomes. And the first is, it will be a good use of the land. It will take land that's currently lying fallow and not overly suitable for rural use, and it will give it an economic purpose through enabling the expansion of a regionally significant industrial operation. The rural zone to be retained on the upper portion will also enable native vegetation to occur, which is clearly a positive outcome. The second thing is that it will be good for Hines. The expansion will recognise a substantial investment that has been made to the Hines factory site to date, and it will allow the manufacturing plant to remain competitive and will likely avoid the need for all or part of the operation to move to a new location. Thirdly, it'll be good for Pokeno. And the reason for this is that Pocono has grown and flourished in the last decade. And in part, this has been due to the contribution of Hines and the other industrial activities, which provide employment and bring people into the town. So increasing the amount of heavy industrial zone land and allowing for an expansion to Hines will help maintain the role of industrial activities in the town. It will also ensure that Pocono does not become a residential heavy place, given the amount of growth being promoted. It is also good for the strategic industrial node and Waikato generally. It will reinforce the importance of the strategic industrial node, and it will show large organisations that if you come to the Waikato and you make it your home, there may well be opportunities for expansion if an appropriate opportunity arises. So overall, the proposed heavy industrial / rural zone for the site at 62 Bluff Road represents a positive planning outcome. This analysis was accepted by Mr. Mead. So having looked at that first aspect, I think we then turn to the Havelock Village rezoning request. And we address this in our second brief of evidence, where we oppose the Havelock Village proposal. The first reason for opposing the Havelock Village proposal related to the visual, landscape, lighting, traffic and stormwater issues. These matters have already been discussed at length today by other witnesses, so I'm not going to go into them with a lot of detail. But the one point that we would make is addressing these matters through resource consents is fine if there's only one or two development proposals. But in a situation where there are many development proposals, as in Pokeno, good planning requires a more comprehensive and a more integrated approach, such as a structure plan. Now, the second reason our evidence opposed the HVL proposal related to potential reverse sensitivity effects. Now, we've already gone over some of the detail around that, but to explore reverse sensitivity effects and Havelock proposal relative to Hines and the other heavy industrial activities, we're going to do that through looking at a couple of questions. And the first question is, has there been reverse sensitivity effects on the Hines site in the past? And the answer to this is yes, there has been. You know, the occupants of 10 Bluff Road, which is the site adjoining 62 Bluff Road, complained about lighting effects. And the result of this was that Hines bought the land. This confirms that resident reverse sensitivity effects are real in relation to the Hines site. They're not theory, they are real. However, aside from that one incident with 10 Bluff Road and a couple of others that Mr. Hines noted this morning, there has not been wide-scale reverse sensitivity issues. And in our view, this is because the Pocono structure plan adhered to sound planning principles. And it located the aggregate extraction zone adjoining the Hines site. This zone meant that Hines had a buffer of quarry land around it, and then a further buffer of 500 metres separation as required from that aggregate extraction zone. So these sound planning principles has meant the situation has been managed up until now, and these sound planning principles gave Hines the confidence to invest and develop in their land. The second question that we wish to put forward is, how does the Havelock Village proposal change this situation? What does it do? How does it bring about reverse sensitivity effects? And the answer to this is that the Havelock proposal cuts hard against sound planning principles that were established by the Pocono structure plan. It places residential development, a sensitive use, hard against heavy industrial operations. On top of that, the sheer scale of the Havelock Village proposal, 550 homes, and the elevation of the site means that there will be over 1,000 sets of eyes with a grandstand view of the heavy industrial operations. To confirm that there are in fact direct views, we have prepared some cross sections, and these were provided in our supplementary evidence, and I'll ask Mr. Chairman to cover that.
Yeah, so Mr. Chairman, if it's all right, I'd just like to pull up those cross sections that we provided.
Yes, that's fine. Thank you.
There, yeah. So this is the overall layout plan that we have. The yellow lines that you see there are taken from the buffer areas that Hines and Mr. Lambert has recommended for inclusion. So those lines there run from the buffer areas towards the Hines site over the existing Sydney land as well. So you'll see buffer area 1, we've taken a line of sight from the cross section area here. These black lines that are next to each of these other yellow lines are the ones that Havelock Village's rebuttal evidence has provided with their lighting evidence. So we've tried to take a point of reference from similar to those locations there. You'll see the squares there with the X and the other potential house sites, which you'll see on the next cross sections as we go down. Just to give you an idea, illustrating where the houses may or could be located. Now, that's just a sample of where the houses may go along those lines. The other thing to note is this is the buffer. This blue line here is the noise buffer that Havelock Village have proposed. And the line back here is the back of our Hines buffer that we're seeking. So, these are the two areas of the buffer that we seek for inclusion. So if you keep that in mind, when I flip to the next cross sections, you'll see these house sites here and a couple there we've just noted, just for your reference where the houses would be. So I'll just flip to, sorry, I've gone on too far. Right, so that's the black line that was shown on the Havelock Village evidence, and these are the lines of sites that we've drawn from the existing ground levels. So that's the Sinlay property there, and then the Hines site is down here. So this is that first cross section you saw in area 1.
Could you just make that a little bit bigger, please? It's very hard to see the lines on screen here. Even if we see one graph at a time, that's a lot better. Thank you. Maybe just maybe down one side. That'll do. That's it. You got it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So that's Sinlay. You'll see that that's similar.
Maybe take it down one size so you can see it, so you don't have to slide left. That'll do. That's much better. Thank you.
All right. So that's the line to the centre. I'll focus on. You can look at those when you have more time. I'll focus on the cross sections that are shown to the Hines site. So here's the one from area 1, and you'll see that blue line there is the noise buffer that Havelock Village are proposing. Hines is over here. And then these are the 3 house point locations that we've just identified with lines of sight going down to. Sorry, it's all right. Yeah, going down to the line. So we've taken some points of reference from the existing ground levels of the Hines operation, and this is these shaded areas here show you the heights that could be developed on that property. Hines, these lines of sights are taken back towards where the current development area of Hines is, and you'll see these dash lines projecting out here relate to the development area still yet to be undertaken within the Hines site. So there's still areas further to be developed on each of those cross sections, and that's illustrated there. So there's 4 sets of cross sections. I'll just take you through them. You'll see them there down. Just one thing to note on the last cross section. Now this is from the northern area 2. It's in the section here. There is one thing that isn't shown on here. All right, can you just move it across the Yeah, so in here there's an industrial, around about the 700 chainage here, there isn't a strip of light industrial land proposed by Havelock Village. In that zone, it's about 30 to 50 metres wide. There is a barrier or industrial building or barrier that would be constructed. So in effect, this house on this particular point would be looking directly into an industrial building or barrier. However, there's still lines of sight able to achieve at this level up here. So just for reference, that's a single story dwelling that I think we've put at about 5 metre height limit from top to bottom, and then that's a 2-story building illustrative of a 7.5 metre height maximum from the ground level to the top of the roof there. So yeah, basically we're just trying to show here that the lines of sight that you see directly to Sinlay are well elevated above, to Hines, are well elevated above their property. And you'll see that based on the existing ground level there on the Hines property, it's very difficult for them to screen or try to internalise their effects. So their boundaries about here, Hines, Sinlay's in here, but for Hines to try and do anything to try and screen themselves from the upper hill slopes is very difficult.
Okay.
Anything else?
I think that what those those sections show is that when you have a 2-story or a single-story building sitting in areas 1 and areas 2, they will have views, direct views of Hinds and Sinlay, and they will also have direct views of what Hinds and Sinlay may develop in the future. So having confirmed that there's views, it means that residents in Havelock Village will be sitting on their decks, sitting in their lounges and looking out their windows at new and existing buildings. They'll be looking at lights, white ones, orange ones, flashing ones. They'll be looking at the dust that comes up from the yard operations. They'll be looking at air discharges and dangerous goods and chemicals and truck movements. And for some, these things will create a level of annoyance. And because they are constantly in people's view, 24/7, they will stay front of mind for those people. And they may well complain. Now, Havelock Village have put the view that it doesn't matter that people will experience these effects, because if heavy industrial operations comply with the standards in the plan, there won't be a problem. You know, people may complain, but it won't bring about change and it won't constrain the Hinds operation. But this view misses the point, as whether or not Hinds or the other operations comply with the standards in the district plan is irrelevant to residents. What matters is what they experience. And if they experience what they consider to be unreasonable noise or lighting or dust or unreasonable visual effects, they will consider this to be an intrusion into their living environment, irrespective of if it complies or not. As such, they may well complain to council, but moreover, they will be especially concerned about any future changes or any additional development that Hinds or Sinlay or other industrial activities may want to do, because they will view this as being something that will even heighten or accentuate the imposition on them even further. So in this context, I'm going to ask Mr. Chima to quickly explain what potential future resource consents that Hinds may need.
So just as you've heard from the evidence from Mr. Hinds, just to reiterate that Hinds haven't fully developed their site, and when you consider the evolving nature of their operation, it's highly likely that they'll need to seek further consents. So just to assist the panel, we've identified a few of the rules in the heavy industrial zone that would require consent. It's also important to note that these consents I'm about to list, or potential infringements, all have visual amenity or amenity values as a matter of discretion.
Can we put up the map of the site again? A photo of the site area. Yeah.
Okay, so we have, for example, we have earthworks with a cut greater than 1 metre or a volume more than 500 cubic metres, buildings exceeding a height of 20 metres or 35 metres over 2% of the site, outdoor storage areas which exceed 30% of the site or 9 metres in height, activities exceeding the glare and artificial lights bill standard. So those rules are not an extensive list of all the types of consents that could be required by Hinds, but in our view, they're fairly standard reasons for consent, or that Hinds may seek consent in the heavy industrial zone. It's also important to understand or note that Hinds and Sinlay both already have existing consents to operate the factory. Now, that is in the heavy industrial zone where they needed consents for various infringements, one of which was exceeding the building height limit. Now, those consents were processed on a non-notified basis with an adjoining aggregate extraction zone and with no neighbours being affected. So if residential housing is now allowed to establish overlooking the industrial land, then the assessment of these types of applications would change. Just talking from my experience in the processing of applications, when I'm looking at a consent application that has a criteria requiring the consideration of visual amenity, when I'm out on site or looking at a proposal, I'm considering the residents who can see the site. That would be my starting point and general rule of thumb when assessing a resource consent application. So a good example of this is a consent for an outdoor storage area. It requires consideration of visual amenity on surrounding residents. So in this case, a minor visual effect would mean that Hines would have to obtain written approval of all the residents, or they would, the residents would be notified and have the opportunity to object to a proposal. So it's hard to see how Hines could internalise and mitigate a visual effect from elevated land overlooking the site. And just refer back to those cross sections that you saw that showed the change in levels from Hines to the Havelock Village land. So in a sense, and I'll get to the point, essentially this process and the proposal by Havelock Village could restrict Hines' ability to obtain consents in the future, or could force Hines into reducing or amending the way in which they use their land, or even they could have additional conditions or constraints placed on them. Then these are things that Hines are currently protected from with the adjoining aggregate extraction zone. And
I think we understand the point. It's being made about 5 different ways and 5 different times over. I think probably best if you just move on. Thanks.
So collectively, we see the HVL proposal as having a perfect storm for reverse sensitivity effects. It has inappropriate uses located in close proximity to each other. Those are accentuated by the large scale of the development and the elevation of the Hines site, combined with the need for Hines and Sinlay and others to get future consent, requirement for future consents that residents will want or seek to have input into. This may then constrain Hines and Hines operations. So having established that there is the potential for reverse sensitivity effects, we then need to look at what has HVL done to address those effects. And the obvious answer is that they've put in a buffer. And look, that is a good start. However, it is a noise buffer. It matches a noise contour. As such, it's effective at addressing noise, but it does not, and it cannot be effective at addressing overlooking of the heavy industrial land. In our view, this is a fundamental flaw. So collectively, with the perfect storm for reverse sensitivity effects and the fact that they haven't been addressed well enough in the provisions, we consider that this could have roll-on effects and that Hines will not be able to contribute or may not be able to contribute to the employment and regional economy in the same way as they may have been able to if they were operating in an unconstrained environment with aggregate extraction land behind them, or at the very least, without a residential catchment behind them. So collectively, we consider the concerns raised by the other specialists and the potential for reverse sensitivity effects means that the HVL proposal should be declined. And if that was the case, the council would be adhering to sound planning principles and would be upholding the integrity of the provisions of the regional policy statement and the proposed plan, all of which seek to avoid reverse sensitivity effects. Such an approach would protect the regionally significant Hines operations and will give the wider industrial sector confidence that if they locate in the Waikato, their interests will be protected. However, if the panel was minded to approve the HVL proposal, we consider there needs to be 4 key amendments. The first amendment is that set out by Mr. Lambert this morning, and it relates to including areas 1 and 2 in the buffer. I'm not going to go over that, but I think what that solution does is it delivers a clear and robust solution because it's long-term, it's enduring, and really it answers the question. It says, look, houses are fine here and houses are not fine in this location.
Look, I think we understand the basics of planning. So could you just please get to the point?
Yeah.
Stop embellishing everything.
Sorry. So with the other amendments that we seek relate to the provisions in the subdivision provisions, and they relate to seeking prohibited status in the table, so that buildings, roads and structures have prohibited status. At the moment, they have non-complying status. The second amendment seeks to ensure that the Pocono industry buffer is created as a single lot. We think this is important because it means that that environmental protection area or the Pocono industry buffer will be held in one lot and be able to be managed in one lot. And then the third amendment relates to the matters of discretion for subdivision, and it seeks some additional wording that Mr. Mead and Mr. Tolomarsh agreed in relation to the other environmental protection area. And I'll read that wording to you. It says that the ownership and ongoing management of the environmental protection area, and we're suggesting adding in Pocono industry buffer, should include a no-build, should be a no-build buffer, it should be revegetated, and it should be controlled to prevent further subdivision of the buffer area, such as through covenants, consent notices, or vesting in council. We see that as a solution that was agreed by Mr. Mead and Mr. Tolomarsh on the other environmental protection areas, and we think it's appropriate to also put in place on the Pocono industry buffer area.
Very good, thank you. Let's see if there's any questions for you. Mr. Fulton, any questions?
You did say there had been 2 complaints. I think we heard 4 from Bluff Road this morning. What is the nature of the complaint to the council about the lighting? I mean, they can complain, but is there any effect because it's already there?
They can complain. The key issue is that if Hines go to seek a future consent to infringe the lighting standard, that party could become an affected party, and that consent could become notified, and then there could be either difficulty obtaining the consent or controls put in place to limit down the scope of that consent.
Okay, so I understand that. So it's more about the ongoing development of the site that could be opposed.
Correct.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yep, I understand that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sedgwick.
No, nothing from me, thank you.
Ms. Gibb,
No questions.
Ms. Teaho,
No, nothing from me. Thank you.
Ms. Gibb, please. Oh no, I think I've already done that, haven't I? Mr. Cooney, thank you.
No, thank you.
No, and I had no questions either, thank you.
Thank you.
So that's the, so I'm not in the picture, but that's the case for Hines.
Thank you, Mr. Laddard. I thought you were doing some visual mitigation there for a point, but then you popped back into view.
Sorry about that.
That's quite all right. Thank you very much.
Anything would be improved without me in the shot, I agree.
You're back behind the ridge line. Very good. Thank you very much, everybody. That's helpful. Mr. Laurie, is Mr. Laurie here now? Just trying to see whether Mr. Laurie's here. Yes, you are. Thank you, Mr. Laurie. Just when you're ready, thanks.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't seem to have video, but you'll have to take your chances that I'm still good looking. My submission is largely set out in the note of 15 February, and that's still relevant, I believe. Just note that our clients own the big chunk of land that's shown in the diagram on the front of that submission, and they purchased a little bit on the side that we're now wanting to add on or into the village zone. So that's been purchased and is amalgamated into their parent title, and there it's on the plan. So it's the area edged in red on the right-hand northeastern corner. The bit where the pointer is currently is almost approved as a resource consent for 83 lots, and that will hopefully be approved in the next 1 to 2 months. And it seemed logical to include the area edged in red into that development, because provision's been made for the road to hook into that and also into the land to the north, which would leave the opportunity for a road to link out to Bed Road in the future if necessary. The land to the east, which the council planner has suggested is farmland, is truly farmland, but as you can see in the left-hand diagram, it's subject to flooding. So it's relatively poor land and is physically separated from the main, from the piece we're now talking about by a reasonable watercourse that you can see the wiggly line. So while it's adjacent, it's effectively currently an island of grass that can't be used. As I've already said, we're providing a road link to that land and the land to the north. So all the affected amenities can be easily provided as part of the current development, which is proceeding. And that's probably all I need to say at this stage, unless there's some questions.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Laurie. Let's see if there are any questions. Can we start with you, Ms. Sedgwick, please?
Sure. Mr. Laurie, can you just elaborate for me on the services that are currently available and why, when would you expect services to be, infrastructure services to be available?
Yes, I can. At the moment, we are negotiating a development with the development, what's it called? With the council about upgrading not Bed Road, Dean Road, and the power and telephone will all come along that, and the rest of the services will be self-supporting, although the council engineers have said that there is a possibility we could introduce water supply, but that's currently not on the immediate program.
Right. Thank you. That's all from me.
Thank you. Ms. Gibb?
No, nothing, thanks.
Mr. Fulton?
Oh, I have no questions. Thank you.
Ms. Tiaho?
No, nothing from me. Thank you.
Mr. Cooney?
Can you stick up the map again? Thanks. Yeah, that'll be right. That area out to the east, are you saying that you've applied for consent for that land to what, become village zone, is it?
Yes, that's the current hearing. I did, there was a submission earlier on for convert the whole lot to residential, but clearly we haven't done enough work to support that at this stage. So the land where the pointer is currently in the final stages of resource consent for village, and we're just looking to add that rural piece onto it.
So just to get this straight, the proposed plan shows that area there in the beige colour. That's a proposed, that's village zone, is it?
Yes, that's correct.
And you have applied for consent to develop that area.
Yes, that's right.
And you've also applied for consent to the one out to the east.
No, not yet.
Not yet.
No, that's still zoned rural, and unless I'm successful here, that'll stay rural.
Okay, and the bottom bit there, that's still rural.
Yes, it is. That's all floodable land down there, so development's not going to extend that far.
Okay. Yeah. So your subdivision extends just to that beige area, yeah, that's shown, yeah, there.
Yes, that's right.
And Has it been publicly notified?
No, it's been treated as non-notifying.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Cooney. And I have no questions. Thank you, Mr. Laurie. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Which now brings us to Thorntree Orchards, Parkmere Farms, and Mr. and Mrs. Young, please.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Jeremy Graven, barrister, speaking on behalf of Thorntree, the Youngs and Parkmere Farms, and I'm sitting right down the end of the long table, I'm sorry. But the first thing to check is that you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thank you. So with me, Commissioners, in the room, I have Mr. Growler, Ms. Jack, Mr. Vile, and then also Claire, Pat and Jane Dobson, who are part of Thorntree, along with Mr. McGregor. So that covers planning, landscape, urban design, civil engineering, and then we should have Mr. Gary Black, our traffic engineer, should have dialed in separately. So I understand he's online. I certainly hope he is. So that is whom you have online, sir. And I presume that the panel has pre-read all of the submissions and evidence that's been put before you. And as a result, I wondered if it would be helpful, Commissioners, if we just briefly took you to some visuals to orient you with the site. Otherwise, I'm happy to progress with addressing submissions and evidence. I'm in your hands in that regard.
Well, we're probably in yours as much as anything else, in the sense that you proceed as you see fit. But I think it probably would be helpful just to set the scene in the way that you've suggested, if that suits you.
Yes, happy to do that, sir. So I'll ask Mr. Growler, who has control of the laptop and hence what he can throw up on the screen, just to briefly talk you to some of those key documents which will give you the backdrop to where the site is and what is proposed.
Okay, I'm going to attempt to share the screen. Share. Can you just confirm that you can see a road and hierarchy connectivity plan, please?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, cool. So this is a plan that we prepared as part of the indicative master plan to support the evidence base. Can
you make that just a slight bit bigger, please?
Yeah, I'll try.
Or are we teasing your technical ability?
It's just that the laptop's quite far away from me, so I'll get to another plan that's got in a bit more detail. But what we've got is we've got the Pocono settlement through here, the main street, and State Highway 1 running north-south roughly, and then State Highway 2 as you get down the Bombays, as you go to Tauranga or Coromandels. And then the area in red here is what we've called Pocono East. It includes, it's roughly a triangle shape. It includes, it's sort of bisected, bookended on two sides by, there's an old church that's now been converted to a residential house as you go up Deans Road. This is where you come off the roundabout, you go up Deans Road and onto Avon. And then you've got St. Mary's on the hill on the top end. On the opposite side of that, you've got Pocono Domain, and you've got the very popular dog park and some tennis courts there as well. You've got on this side of State Highway 2, you've got some industrial use with I think it's the Burt sawmill operation as you're going out to Tauranga. Further around behind it, you've got a lot more, some recently developed rural residential type development, sort of larger, sort of 2 hectare, 3 hectare lots, lifestyle village type development. And then you circle back around to Deans Road and then across to Pocono. Like I said, Main Street through here, and then the more recent development done by Dines through here as well. So that's the context of where we are. So this is the area. I'll take you through essentially just a couple of context plans that just shows where we've got. Our experts can talk to this, but the main features just to note is a gully system through here, north-south, roughly. It's a very flat contour for the most part. You've got a stream and a wetland system through here, and it also coincides roughly more or less with the national grid transmission lines that cross over here as well. But you can see this is a slope analysis that it's relatively flat and gentle for most of the grades, and it's got some old shelter belts in there as well with vegetation. This is a good site just to give you as well. It's just an isometric Google image. So that coloured area is the site in question that we're talking about, Pocono East. This is the domain, the old cemetery here, and then this is Dean's Road as you cross down the underpass into the rest of the Pocono village through here. That's probably the main points just to locate us, Jeremy.
Yep, thank you. So, Commissioners, then my legal submission, which you already have before you, happily, perhaps, for me and for you, this is not a matter where I think there are a huge number of knotty legal issues to engage with. In this case, my submission commences by referencing, and I'm referring to the clients as TYP for brevity, the submissions lodged by TYP on the notified plan. You'll be familiar with the fact that those submissions sought a village zoning, and both my legal submission and the evidence on behalf of TYP explain how and why the submitters now seek an outcome which is a future urban zone, noting, however, that the village outcome, of course, remains on the table. So it's within scope. That does remain an outcome for the land that it is open to you to determine is the appropriate one. And there may or may not be developments before you around the village zone itself and the way that that zone works, the density of development that provides for. But those outcomes are on the table for you, but the submitter's position today is that an appropriate outcome for this site is a future urban zone. That has been addressed in the framework reports, which you've of course read. There are responses with respect to matters in detail in the evidence on behalf of the submitters. In paragraph 10 of my submission, I do add, with respect to the question of growth capacity, and this may be something that has been before you and in your thoughts during the course of these hearings, I do say that the panel can and arguably should zone more than the demand plus 20% threshold in the NPSUD, so long as infrastructure matters are satisfactorily addressed. And there are a range of reasons why I say that. I can expand on those if that's of interest to you. But of course, it ties back to some of those core objectives of the NPS and the outcomes it's trying to create in the New Zealand urban development environment, if we can call it that. Turning then to why what is proposed here is appropriate. I comment briefly in my legal submission on matters which ultimately are ones which you will make findings on the facts about. But those, of course, relate to issues of capacity. They relate to considerations of higher order documents. They relate to a range of considerations relating to effects. I don't propose to talk in any detail about the legal framework within which you as commissioners and the panel are working. That will have been done to death, I'm sure, by those ahead of me. And as far as I'm aware, the matters you have to consider are essentially conventional considerations in that respect with settled case law. And that would extend through to the the whole lens one approach issue, which was dealt with by you as a panel earlier in time, and I don't see any need to go through that unless you feel it is important I do so. The evidence that you have in front of you, I won't summarise, but do note simply that it canvasses planning, urban design, traffic, economic, civil engineering, landscape. So the key matters have been addressed by witnesses for the submitters at a level of detail that is appropriate to a plan change proposal. And you will have seen that the professional opinions of Mr. Grala for the submitters and Ms. Foley on behalf of WDC are essentially in agreement. And as I understand it, the 42A report prepared by Mr. Mead also is in alignment that a future urban zoning for this land in question is appropriate. I make some comment from paragraph 26 onwards in my legal submission with respect to some evidence from Mr. Wes Edwards that raises some criticisms about some aspects of traffic infrastructure and whether that can be appropriately dealt with, and whether the challenges Mr. Edwards sees are such that you should not impose the zoning that the submitters seek. And I say simply that you should rely on the responses from TYP's traffic engineer, Mr. Black, and of course not lose sight of the fact that this is not a resource consent hearing. This is a hearing with respect to appropriate planned zoning, and for reasons identified by Mr. Black and by Mr. Grala, those issues can be appropriately dealt with. Water and wastewater servicing, I make some commentary on as well, and the key issue there, you will have seen that the summary statement of Mr. McGregor enlarges somewhat on the position he had earlier put before you as a result of further engagement with Watercare, and it transpires that in short, water and wastewater provision is a matter that can easily be addressed, and as a result, the key outstanding issue really to be aware of from an infrastructure perspective by reference to this land is a traffic related one, and specifically the state highway. And the fact that either we need an outcome here where those state highway integration issues and intersection issues are resolved in advance is one outcome. The other outcome, which Mr. Grala can speak to, is whether a live zone, you could go so far as to say that a live zone could be imposed on the basis that there are provisions in the plan which ensure development does not occur in a way which falls short from an integration perspective, because development will not be able to occur until that infrastructure has been appropriately upgraded. So there is a choice, I think, to be made there, a decision to be made on your part. But in either case, the position of TYP is that the evidence they have put before you, which canvasses all the necessary areas you need advice on, indicates that an appropriate outcome here is certainly a future urban zone, and there does remain an opportunity, if the panel felt it appropriate, to impose a live zone so long as there is comfort that remaining infrastructure concerns can be appropriately managed through provisions in the plan. So that is all I propose to address you on as a primary statement. I'm of course happy to answer any questions, and otherwise I have a suite of witnesses here whom we will get to give you brief summaries and you can question. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Brabant. Let's see if there are any questions for you. Ms. Gibb?
Oh, nothing at this point, thanks.
Ms. Sedgwick?
No, nothing from me, thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
Yeah, just a question on should you're asking for future urban, But should a decision be made to make it live zone, how quick could your group organise themselves into starting to develop it? Are they in a position to go? Should that happen? I mean, all things being equal, with the transport issue being sorted out. I mean, it's a reasonably flat block of land and easy to set out an urban, I would have thought. So I'm just asking the question is, are they in a position to be ready to go pretty quick?
So I'm going to have to give a qualified answer, I think, sir. I do have clients here, and I'll put it to either Claire or Pat Dobson, who are one of the submitters shortly. What I would say initially is that, and they will confirm for you, they themselves are not in the business of property development. So I know that the panel are hearing from various entities which hold land in Pocono that are in the business of development. These submitters are people who have lived on the land and worked the land for some time and are not in that business themselves. So I know that they will need to take appropriate advice, and they have, of course, already engaged with some large consultancies like Harris and Gresson to get advice. That would be part of the equation. They may well also need to raise finance, and I'm not in a position to comment on how long that would take. And there will need to be some coalescing of owners in this area to talk about how development would be managed. That could happen on their own account as a group, or it might be that another entity comes in and purchases the land as a block. But beyond that, I can't take that any further, sir, although I would agree that from the perspective of physical challenges, the land is relatively developable. So there is a benefit in that regard. What I will now invite to my left, which perhaps might be reversed on the screen you're looking at, but Pat and Claire Dobson and Jane Dobson are here. I'll ask one of them just to give any comment, if they're able to, on timing. So I'll ask them to do that now.
Okay, thank you.
In short, no, we haven't considered any form of development. It's we're farmers really. We've been in that business for a few years now, and the development side of it hasn't crossed. We've not afforded ourselves, I guess, that luxury of thinking too far ahead from where we are today.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe I can add one thing, sir. Just to, I guess, just remind Pat that we've spent probably the last 6 months developing quite a large evidence base to support the submission. So we've prepared a indicative master plan that sets out how this area might be developed. Now that isn't it's a pretty robust plan in that it's been integrated with a whole lot of specific assessment by various experts. So it's not a fluffy picture, if you will. It's something that we're relatively confident could be developed and is based on good principles. So I think we're already, the Dobsons are quite far ahead of the curve in terms of a development process. So if they were of the mind to click the go button, they're not starting from a standing start. They've got some momentum there already.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Tauho?
Just one question. It was in relation to your submission that the panel should be agreeing to zoning or more than 20% subject to infrastructure. What's the should based on? What's the word should be based on?
So you're referring there to my can and arguably should. So like all good lawyers, I left myself a slight out. But I think the answer there, Commissioner, is that the whole premise of the NPS fundamentally, and you will be familiar with its wording, is that councils have not been doing enough, that more needs to be done. And in particular, if you look at objective 2 of the NPS, there is an express reference to supporting competitive land and development markets. And if you've been involved in the resource management space for some time, you will have all heard, at the very least, anecdotal reference to people land banking, to areas zoned for development, which end up being owned by one or only a few landowners, where land release is slow and controlled, and that has a whole lot of knock-on effects then for pricing. Now, that outcome that is sought by the NPS is intended to change the game around competitive land markets. It's intended to put this country and individual districts, particularly those tier 1 and tier 2, try and get them ahead of a curve. That's why there is reference to there being a margin over and above minimums. And that is evident when you look further into the detail. So, for example, if you look at, say, clause 3.2 of the NPS, you will see a reference there: every tier 1, 2 and 3 local authority must provide at least sufficient development capacity, of course sufficient being defined, but the term used is at least. So this is not a target which you should not exceed. This is a target which is intended to be a bottom line. And my recollection is that if we go to, say, clause 3.6, you will see a reference there to housing bottom lines. What you won't find anywhere in that NPS is any express reference to a ceiling or a roof that should not be exceeded. My understanding of this document, when the rubber hits the road on it, is that the real constraints relate to infrastructure. That you obviously would have a concern if so much was zoned all at once without any appropriate provisions constraining it, that it put intolerable infrastructure pressure on. But so long as appropriate provisions are in place to manage the rollout of infrastructure, then it is only an upside if we create a more competitive market for land, that there are more players in that market. And I also see, as a subset of that, some advantage from the perspective of infrastructure planning and funding, that putting zoning in place gives certainty then around what is intended to occur and will occur moving forward from a development perspective, rather than some of those classic old problems we used to have when one came to consider a future and it was set out in some sort of structure plan which had no statutory basis. That structure plan was old, no one knew when it was going to flow through, and what did that mean then for provisioning for infrastructure. So those are the core reasons why I say that you should err on the side of generosity, if you like. And the final factor, and you will be familiar with this because you are the people sitting through it, is that this exercise takes a very long time to go through one of these planning exercises. This district has had these plans notified some time ago. There's a whole lag until we get to the process that you are in the middle of now. There's many months of hearing. There's a need for decisions to be made. There's provision then for appeals. There is a very big time lag within which all the time people are moving to around this country, are moving to this country, and demand for housing continues to climb. So that is why I made that submission, Commissioner.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kearney.
And no, thank you.
No, and I have no questions either. Thank you. Let's hear from the witnesses. Thanks, Mr. Brevin.
Thank you. Well, in that case, perhaps, sir, we might start with, I think, sir, maybe I'll start with a familiar face who you've heard from very recently. He's very keen to get in front of you again. That, sir, is Mr. McGregor, just to deal with those civil engineering issues. That's a nice straightforward matter to deal with up front.
That's fine. I think we can also say, sorry, there's some feedback coming from somewhere. Sorry about that. I think it's also safe to say that the fuzz zoning seems resolved as between your clients and the council folk. So I don't think there's any need for the witnesses to go into chapter and verse about things. I think we can skip quite quickly to our questions of them. So I don't think they need to laboriously trawl through each and every point in their summaries or.
No, that's fine, sir. And we have had that very discussion of how we're leading into this. So I'll turn over to Mr. McGree.
Thank you.
Afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
So I think I'll just run through the kind of conclusion summary points, if that's all right, based on obviously discussion today. So effectively, the submitters are all landowners within the area we've described, which is about 63 hectares in total, but has about 24 different landowners within that. I've reviewed and assessed the master plan that was provided, and basically assessed that on a residential zoning, because basically under a fuzz there doesn't really carry any, obviously any kind of density relevant to that zoning. So in accordance with that, in terms of stormwater, and obviously talked to stormwater already today, but effectively we haven't done any detailed analysis for this site, but I don't believe there are quite the constraints on this particular site as there are on some of the other sites. It's within a separate catchment to the Pocono West areas, and in my view there is a solution that can be developed in accordance with district plan, and that would be done again on a catchment wide basis, and look at as part of a kind of plan change or a consenting process. Moving to wastewater and potable water. So I think in my original evidence I was fairly reserved, I guess, in terms of what might or might not be allowed for. However, subsequent to that original initial submission and my subsequent evidence, I have met with Watercare, and suffice to say, surprisingly somewhat, they are quite advanced with their planning for not only this area but for the remaining area around Pocono in terms of how they might service development around the area. And indications from there is that could be as kind of quick as 5 years sort of thing, 3 to 5 years, so well within the fuzz, and you know, in line with some of the other discussions, potentially in line with a more you know, a live zoning, I suppose, in terms of the time it would actually physically take to, you know, potentially bring some of the development online. And I guess there was obviously, given the acknowledgement that there was some analysis that Watercare had done in advance of this planning process, to me there seemed to be some level of confidence from them that should the development proceed, that they would be able to provide connectivity to their network and provide for the capacity required in order to service such a development. And I think that really probably summarises the three kind of key infrastructure challenges from my view. So stormwater, obviously there still needs to be a fair bit of work there, and looking at the broader catchment as to how this development might sit within that broader catchment. And then from a wastewater water point of view, yes, there's some work to be done, but the planning for provision for infrastructure is actually quite well advanced on Watercare's side.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. McGregor. We'll see if there's any questions for you. Ms. Sedgwick?
No, I don't. Thank you very much.
Ms. Gibb?
No, thanks.
Ms. Tiaho?
No, thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
No, I don't have questions. Thank you.
Mr. Kearney?
No, thank you.
And I have no questions either. Thank you very much, Mr. McGregor.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now, just sticking with some of the pragmatic infrastructure side, hopefully we have Mr. Black on the line at bottom left. Right, so I think he's there, and I would invite him to briefly present to you now.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, I'm here. I've obviously prepared my statement, summary statement, and I'll probably go through the major infrastructure requirements that I believe would be required for for any future urban zone and subsequent residential zoning.
Thank you.
I visited the site at the start of the assessment, and obviously, sitting in the current rural area, there are a number of upgrades that would be required to transition from the rural to a residential area as part of Pokeno. So coming from State Highway 1, Dean Road is actually quite steep. At the moment, it doesn't comply with the requirements for a new build road with a maximum grading of 12.5%, where currently it's sitting at 17%. From a future urban zone and subsequent application for subdivision, etc., I think further assessment would be required at that time to ascertain whether both the bus services can drive up and down the Dean Road with a gradient, whether the construction vehicles can use Dean Road as well. Again, that can be assessed at the time, sometime in the future. Should that not be able to occur, there would have to be a regrade of Dean Road, and subjectively, I estimate the road would have to be lowered by about 2 to 3 meters and provide a constant gradient of 12.5% from the roundabout at the intersection up to the intersection at the top of the hill. So from Avon Road and sorry, just one moment. So the rest of the rural roads, accessing the development would need to be upgraded with full walking and cycling facilities to a full modern urban corridor and meeting the requirements of the plan. Moving on to Avon Road intersection. Again, this is obviously probably a primary safety concern with its current form. There are a number of options that could happen. NZTA are a part of their project looking to do longer term, shorter term safety improvements on longer term realignment of State Highway 2 to the east of Pocono. As a minimum, I would be expecting probably a wire barrier with some form of turnaround facility to the east of the site. That would provide safe access and egress from Avon Road, and potentially as part of the longer term proposals proposed by NZTA to provide a grade separated intersection over State Highway 2 connecting the north and south side of State Highway 2. That would effectively make all movements from all areas a safer left in and left out, which would be a good outcome. The moment with the wire barrier, there potentially would be more people utilising the State Highway 1 intersection to access the State Highway 2. Again, I haven't actually visited the site during peak times, but so Friday afternoon time, traffic would be heavy, and I imagine people would actually choose to use the State Highway 2 intersection, State Highway 1 intersection, travel north and head east on State Highway 2. So in summary, from a future urban zone and future subdivision, there are a number of infrastructure upgrades that would be required, but I think that would be in keeping with the proposal sought here. So, any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Blake. We'll see if there are any questions for you. Ms. Gibb?
Yes, it sounds expensive. And, you know, the road upgrading, and how would your team envisage that would be paid for? Would it be a development agreement with council or something with NZTA? There'd have to be multiple parties, I guess, to this.
I can't comment specifically on the funding side of it, but yes, the State Highway 2 intersection upgrades and corridor upgrades, I think, would be part of the bigger equation, and obviously stuff that's within the main development area. Again, that's subject to obviously discussions downstream with the relevant parties.
Yes, I note there's 24 different landowners, so I would be assuming there'd be one project manager trying to sort it all out. So I'm jumping to that conclusion. But yeah, yes, thank you very much for the information. It was very helpful.
Ms. Sedgwick?
Thank you. Yes, just in regard to that intersection with State Highway 2, what sort of limitations would be put on the development if Wakakatahi NZTA postpone and do not actually come up with anything that's doable?
Okay, so to provide a safe outcome with a minimum investment, again, I would be looking at a wire up barrier for a length probably from the intersection, the main intersection of State Highway 1 and State Highway 2, and then looking at a sort of temporary turnaround facility further to the east. The main purpose would be to for people to use the State Highway 1 intersection and come up Dean's Road to access the site. Again, it's people take the easiest and the safest route from that perspective, but that would be the minimum requirements I would propose for the purposes of accessing the site until NZTA come online with their full proposals.
And would that have a corresponding slowdown in the development of the properties? I'm thinking of number of traffic movements and also the congestion of that area itself.
Yeah, from a pure traffic movements perspective at peak time, I'm not envisaging any problems either at State Highway 1 intersection or on State Highway 2. The main difference would be there would be a higher concentration of traffic on the State Highway 1 intersection. And again, subsequent to any traffic analysis at that intersection, some form of upgrade may be required depending on what the actual traffic results come up with.
Thank you. I'm very familiar with that intersection too. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Tiaho?
No, nothing from me, thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
It's just a question on the current underpass under the State Highway now. I mean, that road, to my view, is inadequate now, and let alone further development that's intended. Somewhere along the line, the addressing of that is not going to fall entirely on thorn trees. It would have to be the whole area would have to pick it up that tab, wouldn't it? I mean, it's a much bigger issue than just one development.
The existing overbridge with the State Highway 1 above Dean's Road.
Yeah, under the highway. Yeah.
So from a capacity of the road, there's a one lane in each direction, which for the traffic volumes I would expect in Pocono would be acceptable. The main problems at the moment is reducing that community severance that bridge could actually have between Pocono East and the rest of Pocono. So appropriate walking and cycling facilities would have to be provided under the bridge, and I would imagine that would be sort of cutting back the side slopes behind the columns that are there currently to provide enough width for cyclists and pedestrians to walk through. At the same time, as per my evidence, is to actually provide alternative walking and cycling facilities between Pocono East and the rest of Pocono. So yeah, it's got its problems, but I think from an engineering perspective, they can be addressed, but that would have to be looked at by a structural engineer.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Cooney?
No, thank you.
No, and I don't have any questions either. Thank you, Mr. Black. Thanks for your evidence.
Sir, so the next witness you'll hear from will be Mr. Vile regarding urban design matters.
Thank you.
Good afternoon all.
Good afternoon.
I'd just like to address urban design matters, as you've all had the material at hand and have had access to that. So I'll just provide a quick summary of the process that we followed and the outcomes that we reached through that process. We followed what I consider to be a rigorous and best practice urban design methodology. We looked in detail at the context of Pokeno East, site in question. We looked at connectivity, both physical and visual. We thought was important to any future organisation. And we have come to the conclusion, based on that analysis, that there is no reason that the site in question couldn't be urbanised in a manner that adds value to the entire community of Pocono by integrating the social infrastructure that already exists in the area, by creating better connections, by enhancing the ecology of the site, waterways, creating access to open space for residents of the existing Pocono community and proposed site. And we think also, as mentioned earlier, the topography of the site lends itself to quite easy development. Enhancements in infrastructure we've assumed would be put in place in order to achieve a plan along the lines of the indicative master plan that we have prepared, which has inbuilt flexibility in it to incorporate different typologies depending on market demand, and we think it would be a great outcome for the community of Pocono. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vile. Let's see if we have any questions for you. Mr. Fulton?
No, I have no questions. Thank you.
Ms. Gibb?
No, thank you.
Ms. Tiaho?
Not for me, thanks.
Ms. Sedgwick?
Not at the moment, thank you.
Mr. Kearney?
No, thank you.
No, and I have no questions either. Thank you, Mr. Vile.
Thank you. And then, sir, you'll hear from Ms. Jack regarding landscape matters.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Commissioners.
Good afternoon.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can, thanks.
Great. I'm sure you've all read my evidence, so I'll just quickly summarise my main points. Those were that I believe the landform is suitable to development, particularly to the east, which has grades no steeper than 1 in 12, the majority. It has a watercourse running from the northwest to the southeast direction and surrounding steep topography, which I recommend be protected. This has topography of steep areas that are 1 in 5 or steeper. And I consider these very valuable areas that can be enhanced ecologically to add to the landscape and public amenity for the area. The surrounding landscape has the capacity to visually absorb the urban development of this area. This is because of the aspect of views due to topography and existing vegetation that's likely to be retained, which I discuss in my evidence. There are limited views to the area, which are primarily transient, which I consider to have a low visual impact. Existing views are limited to developed areas, and I feel those should be enhanced and maintained wherever possible to create connection between the urban areas. And finally, I support a visually nuanced urban form, which has been explored in Mr. Vile's evidence.
Very good. Thank you very much, Ms. Jack. Let's see if we've got any questions for you. Ms. Tiaho?
Not for me, thanks.
Mr. Fulton?
Yeah, no, thank you.
Ms. Sedgwick?
No, thank you. All very clear.
Ms. Gibb?
No, nothing, thank you.
Mr. Kearney?
Thank you.
And I don't have any questions either. Thank you, Ms. Jack.
Thank you, sir. Now, just before we get to Mr. Gralla on planning, I do have, sir, my clients here. There's evidence from Ms. Dobson. We had a discussion here and felt there probably wasn't any need for a summary of any of that, but I thought perhaps it might be appropriate just to check briefly whether there were any questions for Ms. Dobson before we got on to Mr. Gralla to wrap things up.
Let me check. I suspect not, because I think they would have come up during the course of the questions of the various specialist witnesses, but let's just see if there are. Perhaps we'll just go quickly around the room. Ms. Sedgwick?
No, thank you.
Ms. Tiaho?
No, thanks.
Mr. Fulton?
No, I have no further. Thank you.
Ms. Gibb?
Nothing, thanks.
Mr. Kearney?
Nothing, thank you.
And nothing from me either, thank you.
Thank you, sir. In that case, I'll turn matters over to Mr. Gralla to address planning matters.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Again, I'll take it as read that you read my 188 pages of primary statement, and as well as my rather more nuanced 3 pages of summary statement. I'll also take your word for it around the future urban zone, but I would just like to reiterate the higher order planning documents and where Pocono East sits in there. So if I just quickly turn to where it sits in the landscape. So in terms of hierarchy, the Hamilton to Auckland Corridor Plan 2020 is an integrated spatial plan that establishes an ongoing growth management regime for the Hamilton to Auckland corridor. Pocono East is included as an identified development area within this corridor plan. And it identifies it specifically as a potential future urban area, as well as Pocono in the wider sense being identified as a future housing and employment growth cluster with development potential. Then going down to the Future Proof Strategy 2017, you'll already be familiar with that. It's a 30-year growth management plan. Pocono East is it's located adjacent to an existing urban settlement, and it's also within the indicative urban limits for Pocono. So a future urban zone for Pocono is entirely consistent with the growth management approach that's set out in Future Proof, and which is also referenced in the regional policy statement. Then more recently, the Pocono Local Area Blueprint was prepared by Waikato District Council in 2018. This was more of a co-developed blueprint that was worked through a series of intensive consultation and inquiry by design workshops with the public. The blueprint supports the expansion within Pocono East as well. So that's at the more sort of micro scale. You've already heard from all the various experts about why Pocono East is appropriate to be urbanised, and I don't intend to cover that further. I prepared a Section 32 AA assessment to support the future urban zone, and that was appended to my evidence. I also went through the various lenses in detail as well, hence the 188 pages that set out why Pocono East was also appropriate. The one thing that I did talk about in my statement was very early on. So I personally wasn't involved in preparing the submission that sought the village zone. Mr. Brabham and Thorntree engaged me probably mid last year to help them advance this through the plan change plan process. I am not personally and professionally not a fan of rural lifestyle development. I think it's not a very efficient use of land. I was also unconvinced about the idea of it being a transitional urban zone whereby people develop and then over time it becomes urbanized. I set out that quite clearly in my primary statement about why that potentially wasn't a great outcome at the density that was proposed in the notified plan, sort of 3,000, 4,000 square metre lots. And then I also gave some real world examples that I was familiar with, particularly around Karaka, where this has been established 10 years before an area is urbanised, and I see very little change there. So happy to talk about the village zone as a principle, but once the I'm very certain that a future urban zone is entirely consistent with the higher order policy documents, and it's been supported by a detailed analysis that I've included. So that's all I'll probably cover, but I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
All right, thanks, Mr. Growler. Let's see. Ms. Tiaho?
No, thank you.
Ms. Gibb?
No, thank you.
Ms. Sedgwick?
I thank you, Mr. Growler. That was very clear.
Mr. Fulton?
Just you made comment, Mr. Gravel, about the around the Cracker area where there was a village zone allowed to develop, but it hasn't gone much further than that. Is that what you're saying? Once it becomes that, it doesn't seem to want to change into urbanising?
Yeah, and there's a couple of reasons for that. So it's the houses that are there are substantial. So my experience, it's not always the case, but it's a generalisation. Once you get larger lots, the houses tend to be pretty generous. They're also generally located bang smack in the middle of the lot. So they aren't as easy to develop as you would if you were developing it from the outset for an urban density. I also think the people who choose to live there generally choose to do so because they like a certain type of environment and amenity that comes with that lower density. And I think their willingness to develop over time, you would only do that if you needed to. But if you're not in the property development game, you're not necessarily motivated by that, and there might also be some peer pressure not to upset your neighbours. So in that example, I haven't seen any evidence, and I checked when I was preparing the summary statement that was urbanised further. I think it's just you don't have the bones there to enable intensification as you would with future urban zone.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Gibb, did I ask you?
Yes, you did. I've been looking at the maps and just checking where it's all in relation to everything else. And yes, I can see fuzz does seem to be an appropriate way forward there. My biggest concern is that access road on Dean's Road. So I guess there's answers to that.
Very good. Thank you. Mr. Cooney?
No, thank you.
No, I don't have any questions either. Thank you, Mr. Growler. Thank you for your evidence.
Well, in that case, sir, that brings to a close the case on behalf of the submitters, unless there are any further matters which you wish to address us on or question us about.
No, I don't believe there are, because we've asked them as we've gone. I do just want to stress that the reason that we've moved through this very quickly is because we have read the material. There's a very narrow degree of disagreement, if anything, on matters. And that's why we've been focusing on doing the extensive pre-reading that we have done, so that we move through the hearings process efficiently. But I'd hate your clients to think that we've sort of whizzed through this and not given anything very much consideration, because nothing could be further from the truth.
No, that's fine, sir. Thank you for the explanation, but we did talk beforehand about the process and how it works, and I'm sure that they understand, and they certainly have seen the pile of paper that we generated at our end, so they know that there is a process whereby you are working through that in advance. So that's understood. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you very much to you and your team, Mr. Brabant. That brings us to an end of that part of the hearing. I believe that's all the submitters that we're due to hear from today. Is there anybody here who is expecting to be heard and hasn't been? No, it appears not. Well, on that basis, we'll adjourn till 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. And if the panel wouldn't mind just waiting, but if everybody else could log off, please.